Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at the Russia-Ukraine war,
Okay.
but through a specific lens.
Right.
And that is through the lens of realism in international relations.
Yeah.
And to help us unpack this, we're going to be looking at an analysis by Brazilian political science professor Arão Alves.
Okay. Sounds good.
So get ready, because we are going to try to understand what is really driving countries like the U.S. and Russia when it comes to this conflict.
Yeah. A lot of times we see countries making decisions about things and we think,
Right.
what are they doing? Like, why would they make that decision? It seems so counterintuitive. It
Yeah.
seems illogical. But realism gives us a framework for understanding the motivations behind some of those actions.
Okay, so I think before we jump into the specifics of the analysis,
Yeah.
I need a little bit of help understanding what realism is.
Yeah.
I feel like I kind of have a general understanding, but I have a feeling it's a lot more nuanced than what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's not just about being realistic,
Right.
in our everyday sense of the word.
Right.
In international relations, realism is a theory.
Okay.
And it views international relations as kind of this anarchic chessboard
Okay.
where there's no global authority calling the shots.
Right.
So each country is essentially on its own,
Right.
acting in its own self-interest
Okay.
to survive and gain power.
So it's kind of like everyone's looking out for number one and just trying to make the best moves possible to benefit themselves.
Exactly. And because there's no referee, countries are constantly trying to maintain this balance of power.
Okay.
They don't want any one country to become too strong and threaten their own security.
Right.
So they form alliances, they build up their militaries, they engage in all these strategic maneuvers to make sure that nobody gets too powerful.
Okay, so I'm starting to get it now. How does this all play into what we're seeing with the U.S. and Russia in this conflict?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The U.S. and Russia recently had a meeting to discuss what they're calling future cooperation on the Ukraine war.
Okay.
Now, what's fascinating here is that
Right.
neither Ukraine nor any European allies were invited to this meeting.
I'm really trying to wrap my head around what the U.S. is hoping to gain by having this meeting.
Yeah.
From a realist perspective, how can we understand the motivations behind this?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So one way to look at it through the lens of realism is that the U.S. might be starting to accept Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine.
Wow.
Yeah. I know it sounds kind of unthinkable, but accepting those gains may actually create a more stable balance of power in the region.
Okay, so from a realist perspective, we're choosing stability even if it means that,
Yeah.
there's not a just outcome for everyone.
Exactly.
I mean, doesn't that make the U.S. look weak, though?
Well,
And doesn't that just embolden Russia to take even more aggressive action in the future?
you've hit on a key tension within realist thinking, and that is if you accept a country's aggressive actions to maintain stability, do you actually encourage more aggression down the line?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a risky gamble.
Right.
And it's why this meeting has so many people on edge.
Right. Professor Alves, in his analysis, calls Ukraine a pawn in this whole power struggle.
Right.
It's kind of a harsh way to put it, but is that really how realism views these smaller countries?
Unfortunately, it often does. In a world where you've got these really powerful countries kind of dominating,
Yeah.
the smaller nations often get caught in the crossfire. Their choices are limited.
Yeah.
And a lot of times their fate is decided by forces outside of their control.
And one thing that Alves also points out is that the West's push to expand NATO
Yes.
towards Russia's borders
Yeah.
may have actually been what triggered this conflict.
Right.
It's like they poked the bear.
And that argument fits in perfectly with the realist framework.
Oh, okay.
Because from Russia's point of view, NATO expansion was a direct threat to their security. They saw it as an attempt to encircle and contain them. And if you remember, countries are always looking to maximize their security and minimize threats.
Right.
So from a realist perspective, Russia felt like it had to act to protect its own interests.
But, couldn't they have done that through diplomacy?
That's a good point, and that actually brings up a debate within realism itself.
Okay.
Some argue that countries can and should prioritize defensive measures to protect their interests without resorting to aggression.
Right.
So things like diplomacy alliances, building up defenses, those are all options within a realist framework.
Okay, so it's not like a given that they had to invade.
Right.
But they did.
They did.
And that obviously has had ripple effects throughout the entire world.
Absolutely.
And especially in Europe.
Yeah, Europe is definitely facing a whole new set of challenges now.
Yeah, and the fact that they weren't included
Yeah.
in these talks
Right.
between the U.S. and Russia, that's obviously causing a lot of anxiety there.
Yeah.
This is a potential turning point for this transatlantic alliance.
It really is, and this is a perfect example of how realism can help us understand the shifting dynamics of global politics.
Okay.
We should definitely unpack that a bit more in our next segment.
Yeah, let's do that after a quick break.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back. So we were just talking about these U.S.-Russia talks and how Europe seems to be a little bit like the odd one out.
Yeah.
Is this like a sign that this transatlantic alliance is fracturing?
Well, Europe's always had to think about their security.
Yeah.
Especially since the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed. That created kind of a power vacuum in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And NATO, which had been formed to counter the Soviet threat, had to sort of figure out what its new role was.
Right. And it seems like from a realist perspective, the U.S. saw expanding NATO as a way to maintain its own influence in the region, but also to kind of keep Russia in check.
You could definitely see it that way. And a lot of European countries, especially the ones that had been under Soviet rule, were really eager to join NATO. They saw it as a guarantee of their own security.
Right. But like we were talking about before, Professor Alves argues that expanding NATO eastward might have actually backfired.
Exactly.
It might have made things worse by kind of pushing Russia into a corner.
Every time NATO added a new member, it brought the alliance closer to Russia's borders.
Yeah.
And so from that realist viewpoint, that would naturally make Russia feel threatened, right? Like they're being surrounded.
Exactly. They saw it as an attempt to kind of contain them, to limit their power and influence.
Right. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Where one country is trying to protect itself and it ends up making another country feel less safe.
That's the classic security dilemma, right?
Yeah.
One country tries to make itself more secure, and it ends up making another country less secure, and then things just escalate from there.
Yeah.
Right. And it makes you wonder if there could have been like a different path, a different approach that might have actually prevented this conflict.
It's tough to say, hindsight is always 20/20.
Right.
But, it's something to think about for sure.
So the big question now is, what does Europe do?
Yeah.
How do they navigate this new reality?
Right.
They're not a part of these talks, and they're obviously worried about their own security.
Right.
I mean, from a realist perspective, what are their options here?
So one option would be to just get even closer to the U.S.
Okay.
And push for even stronger security guarantees.
Okay.
Basically saying, we need you now more than ever.
But what if the U.S. isn't willing to do that?
Right.
What if these talks with Russia are a sign that America's focus is shifting?
Yeah, that's a big if.
Elsewhere.
Yeah.
What do they do then?
That's when Europe has to make a really tough choice, Yeah.
One
option would be to try to appease Russia.
Okay.
Maybe make some concessions to try to ease tensions. But that could be seen as a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
And it might actually make them more vulnerable in the long run.
Right. It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. But there is another option.
Okay.
We touched on it a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Europe could become more strategically autonomous.
Okay, you mean like building up their own military, more independent foreign policy.
That's right. And from a realist perspective, that's a really interesting possibility.
Okay.
Because if Europe became a major military power in its own right, that would totally change the balance of power, not just in Europe, but globally.
It'd be a huge shift.
Yeah.
So, in a way, this whole crisis, as awful as it is, could be like the push that Europe needs to redefine its role on the world stage.
It's possible, but, let's be realistic here.
Right.
It wouldn't be easy.
Right.
Building up a military that could actually rival Russia's, that would take a ton of money.
Yeah.
A ton of political will.
It would require all the European countries to work together in a way that
historically
they haven't always done.
That hasn't always been easy for them.
And you also have to remember that Europe isn't exactly a united front when it comes to Russia.
That's true.
You've got some countries that are a lot more hawkish.
Right. The ones that share a border with Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're a lot more concerned.
So achieving that kind of unity would be a huge challenge.
It would be a major challenge.
Yeah.
But we've seen throughout history, sometimes it takes a major crisis to really bring about major change.
Right. So this whole thing could really reshape the global landscape in the years to come.
Right.
It's crazy to think about.
It is.
We've talked about the U.S., we've talked about Russia, we've talked about Europe.
Yeah.
But there's another big player we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah.
And that is China.
China.
they've been awfully quiet.
Right.
Given like the scale of this whole thing.
They have.
What's their strategy here?
Well, China, they play the long game, and they're very good at it.
Right.
They're just watching how everything unfolds.
Okay.
Assessing, the risks, the opportunities, and biding their time.
Yeah, it's almost like they're letting the U.S. and Russia kind of wear each other down while they sit back and watch. Is that a cynical way to look at it?
Not necessarily from a realist perspective. It's actually a pretty smart move.
Right.
The longer this conflict drags on, the more it weakens both Russia and the West.
Right.
Potentially leaving, a gap for China to fill.
So they're basically waiting for the perfect moment to make their move.
Exactly.
To take advantage of like the instability created by this war.
Precisely. And don't forget, China has its own ambitions, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region.
Right.
They're watching very closely how the U.S. is handling this.
Okay.
Seeing how committed they are to their allies.
Okay.
And how capable they are of projecting power globally.
It's like they're taking notes.
Exactly.
Learning from our mistakes.
China's a rising power, and they're not afraid to challenge the existing order.
Okay.
They're investing heavily in their military, expanding their economic influence, building strategic partnerships all over the world.
So if we're looking at this through the lens of realism, like, how do we think China's actions in the next few months, years, could potentially impact the balance of power?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
One possible scenario, and, from a realist viewpoint, is that as the U.S. gets more and more entangled in these European security issues, they're going to have less and less capacity to focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
And that could create an opening for China to really assert its dominance in that region.
It's almost like a seesaw.
Yeah.
Like power shifting from one side of the world to the other.
That's a great analogy. And this brings up another really important point about realism.
Okay.
The importance of alliances.
Yeah.
China has been busy strengthening its ties with countries like Russia, Iran, even some countries in Latin America.
So they're building their own network to kind of counter the U.S. and its partners.
Exactly. It's like they're setting up the pieces on the chessboard for a whole new game.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is.
Like, we're witnessing a major turning point in history.
Right. And the stakes are incredibly high.
So just to kind of wrap things up here.
Yeah.
We've been looking at this whole Russia-Ukraine conflict through the lens of realism.
Right.
Looking at the motivations of these major players, the U.S., Russia, China.
Yeah.
We've seen how this war has really exposed Europe's vulnerabilities.
Right.
And it could even be like a catalyst for a whole new global order.
Yeah. And we've just scratched the surface here. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about.
Right.
The economic fallout, the possibility of nuclear escalation.
Right.
The role of technology in warfare, all of that.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I feel like I have a much better understanding now of how realism helps to explain this incredibly complex situation.
Good. I'm glad.
It's definitely a sobering reminder that countries often prioritize their own interests.
Yeah.
Even when it means making difficult choices that impact the rest of the world.
Well said. And it's important to keep in mind that realism is just one lens through which we can view the world.
Right.
There are other perspectives, other theories that offer different insights.
Yeah.
But realism is a really important one to understand if we want to make sense of what's happening in global politics today.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone, on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas on your own.
Yeah, keep learning.
The world is a complex and ever-changing place.
Absolutely.
But the more we understand the forces at play, the more informed and engaged we can be.
Exactly.
So until next time, keep asking questions.
Keep learning.
Keep learning, and keep diving deep. All right, so before we went to break, we were about to talk about China.
Yeah.
They've been really quiet during all this. What's their strategy?
Well, China's playing the long game. They're really good at that. Just kind of watching everything unfold.
Okay.
Assessing the risks and opportunities and just kind of biding their time.
It's almost like they're letting the U.S. and Russia wear each other down while they just watch and wait.
Is that a cynical way to look at it? I don't know from a realist perspective.
Yeah.
It's actually a pretty savvy move.
Okay.
The longer this conflict drags on, the more it weakens both Russia and the West.
Right.
And that could leave a gap for China to fill.
So they're waiting for that perfect moment to take advantage of all this instability.
Exactly. And let's not forget, China has its own ambitions.
Right, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
Especially in the Indo-Pacific, yeah.
Yeah.
They're watching very closely how the U.S. is handling this whole situation.
Okay.
And how committed the U.S. is to its allies and how capable the U.S. is at, projecting power globally.
It's like they're taking notes, learning from our mistakes.
Yeah. China's a rising power, and they're not afraid to challenge the existing order.
Yeah.
They're investing a ton in their military. They're expanding their economic influence.
Yeah.
They're building all these strategic partnerships all over the world.
Yeah. So if we're looking at this through the lens of realism, how might China's actions in the coming, months or years impact this balance of power?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And I think one possible scenario from a realist perspective is that as the U.S. gets more entangled in these European security issues, they're going to have less capacity to focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Okay.
And that could give China an opening to kind of assert their dominance in that region.
It's like a seesaw.
Right.
Power shifting from one side of the world to the other.
It is. And that brings up another important point about realism, the importance of alliances.
Yeah.
China has been busy strengthening its ties with countries like Russia, Iran, and even some in Latin America.
So they're creating their own network of allies to counter the U.S. and its partners.
Exactly. It's like they're setting up the pieces on the chessboard for a whole new game.
It's wild.
It's pretty amazing to watch unfold in real time.
It feels like we're witnessing a major historical turning point.
It does. The stakes are high.
So we've been looking at this Russia-Ukraine conflict through this lens of realism.
Yeah.
We've been trying to understand the motivations of these major players.
Right. The U.S., Russia, China.
We've seen how this war has really exposed Europe's vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And it could set off a chain of events that leads to a totally different world order.
Yeah, and we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more we could talk about. The economic consequences of this war, the terrifying possibility of things escalating to the nuclear level.
Right.
The role of technology and how that's changing warfare.
It's a lot.
It is.
But I feel like I have a much better understanding of how realism helps us make sense of all of this.
Good. I'm glad.
And it's definitely a bit of a wake-up call that countries prioritize their own interests.
Yeah.
Even when it means making tough decisions that impact the whole world.
Absolutely well said. And, it's important to remember that realism is just one way of looking at the world.
Right.
There are other perspectives, other theories that offer different insights.
Right.
But realism is a really crucial one to grasp if we want to understand the forces that are shaping our world today.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found it insightful, and we hope you continue to explore these ideas. The world's a complex place.
It is always changing.
But the more we understand about how things work, the better equipped we are to navigate it all.
Exactly.
So until next time, keep asking questions.
Keep learning.
Keep learning, and keep diving deep.